But in reality, things do not work that way, because that is now going to leave you with a very lopsided product backlog that ignores the realities of the other areas of your business that are potentially impacted. It ignores the realities of the existing technical debt in the technical world. Unless you take that into account, your product backlog is in a priority sequence that does not reflect reality.
BA Blocks, the building blocks for your BA career.
Backlog prioritization is probably one of the tasks that you have in your set of responsibilities as an analyst or as a Scrum Master. And the way that backlog prioritization happens in some organization tends to miss the goal of actually prioritizing and sequencing out the backlog. And so in this video, I'm going to offer you a couple of pointers on some of the things that you can do to better prioritize your product backlog. In the last video, I talked to you about impact analysis and how you can use impact analysis to build a fuller and more complete product backlog for the project team that is trying to deliver the solution. Your job as an analyst, or sometimes as a Scrum Master, is to make sure that the items in your backlog are prioritized so that the project team knows in what sequence to pull in the items from the backlog into their development cycle. And one of the major pitfalls here is that the analyst, sometimes the Scrum Master, whoever's prioritizing the backlog, will rely far too heavily on the product owner or on the customer to do their prioritization. And this is a common mistake that gets made, because if you read the Agile literature, there is usually a strong push for the Scrum Master or for the analyst to work with the product owner, and with the product owner only to prioritize the backlog. And that may make sense academically, but in the real world, that is not how things work. If you recall from our impact analysis video, what is in your product backlog is not simply just a list of the features and the functions that your customer is asking you for. If you've performed impact analysis properly, you also have a list of items in your backlog that have to do with the integration and with making sure that your solution as a whole fits into the application landscape of your company. And it is unlikely that your product owner is going to have that within their purview. So if you just rely solely on your product owner to do the backlog prioritization, they're essentially going to ignore all of the items that they do not understand, or all of the items that do not have a direct impact to their business, and they're going to prioritize the items that they're looking for much higher than the items that need to get built. And that will run you into a situation where you have a very lopsided product backlog that isn't necessarily going to make a whole lot of sense to your development team. And so the way that you correct this issue is that you start with the product owner to make sure you have a clear picture of the business priorities and how they're sequencing out the features and the functions that you've worked with them to build into your product backlog. And then what you do is you reach out to the second set of stakeholders that you need to listen to when prioritizing your backlog, right? If you recall from the impact analysis video, we talked about how you may have a finance team over here, or you may have some other group over there where that is impacted by a lot of what it is that you're trying to build. And you need to make sure as an analyst that you are also factoring in their points of view, because the sequencing of how enterprise software gets built isn't necessarily based on what the user or the end customer is asking for, right? You have to start taking a lot of the dependencies of your other stakeholders, the other folks inside of your organization that are impacted, into account. And once you start to look at it from the other stakeholders' point of view, and you start to factor in their opinions into the big picture here, you'll start to see that how your product owner prioritized the backlog is going to start to look a little bit different than what your other stakeholders want. Now you have to start a bit of a negotiation sometimes, but a lot of times it's has more to do with dependency management, because some of what they're asking for you may not be able to get away from doing upfront before you deliver some customer features, right? So you're starting to see now that your product owner, right, if you just leave it up to them, they're going to just come to you from a business priority, and that is not nearly enough for you to be able to build a good prioritized backlog, right? That is just one perspective. It's probably one of the most important perspectives, because that's who your customers are. But if you only take into account your product owner, you are missing a lot of other important perspectives that need to be factored into your backlog, right? And that leaves us with one more group of people, which is our third group of people that you need to be consulting to make sure that you have a adequately prioritized and sequenced backlog. And that third group are the technical folks inside of your own project team, because the architects, the technical leads, senior developers, configurators on your projects are going to help you identify the interdependencies between some of the components that need to get built inside of your solution, right? So the way that your customers, your product owners, your other business stakeholders view the product is purely from a functional and from a process and from a requirements perspective, right? They're only interested in the items that are going to provide them some sort of a business benefit. The technical folks inside of your team have another set of concerns that need to also be factored into your product backlog so that you have a clear picture of what your backlog should actually be prioritized like, right? So your customers are saying, I want a feature and function. Your development team has a whole series of technical components. They have APIs. They have a lot of interdependencies that may not necessarily feed directly into any of the features and the functions that they need to contend with as they're starting to architect the solution and start to build it out. And what will typically result from your conversations with the technical folks is that they're going to come back to you and say, look, we understand that your product owner wants this before this, but technically speaking, the way our application landscape is structured, that is not possible for us because there are interdependencies between some of the technical components that's going to prevent us from doing that. And unless you factored in that point of view into your backlog, you now have a backlog that is promising your product owners things in a sequence that your team may not be able to deliver to. So if you listen to a lot of the agile literature exists out there, you're going to be left with the impression that your product owner is the person who is supposed to prioritize your backlog. And academically, that may be true, but in reality, things do not work that way, because that, you can see, is now going to leave you with a very lopsided product backlog that ignores a lot of the other realities that your organization is up against, right? It ignores the realities of the other areas of your business that are potentially impacted. You need to factor those things into your product backlog sequencing. It ignores the realities of the existing, they call it technical debt in the technical world, right? There may be a lot of technical debt plus dependencies. There's a lot of things that happen in the technical world that don't match up or line up very clearly with the features and the functions that you need to build out. And unless you take that into account, again, your product backlog is in a priority sequence that does not reflect reality, right? So I hope getting this context and understanding how things work in reality versus how they're taught in academia is starting to give you a richer understanding of the value of what a high-performing analyst does, right? And that you're starting to understand that when you read something like the Scrum Guide or you read any kind of literature out there, they're usually painting a very ideal picture of how things work. And that ideal picture makes a lot of assumptions about the nature of your reality that are not true, right? When you get into the real world, you'll find out that a lot of that academic material actually starts to break down very quickly, because there are a lot of these other types of issues that are typically not addressed. All right, so I'll leave this one here, but in the next video, I'll pick up with stakeholder analysis, because stakeholder analysis is the activity that helps you to identify, beyond just your product owner and some of the people in your direct customers list, helps you to identify some of the other folks that need to be looped in during product backlog prioritization, but also at other stages throughout the solution delivery lifecycle.